The quiet of the forest was deceptive. Mist curled along the ground, hiding jagged rocks and the remnants of a war that had already scarred the earth. Somewhere, not far off, the echoes of artillery fire still lingered in the minds of those who had survived. But today, in this fragile silence, the British command would stumble across something that would make even the most seasoned soldiers pause. Something that seemed, at first glance, almost unreal. It began with reports from reconnaissance units. Rumors, really, whispered among the troops who had seen the aftermath of battles in France and Belgium. Stories of a new German tank, faster and deadlier than anything the Allies had faced, capable of striking with deadly precision before anyone could even react. Most dismissed it as battlefield exaggeration. Tanks had always been terrifying, yes, but the German Panther? That was something else. By early 1943, as Allied forces began pushing deeper into occupied territory, encounters with these machines became impossible to ignore. Survivors would describe them in hushed tones, talking about their thick, sloped armor, the way their guns seemed to pierce through even the heaviest Allied tanks, and most unsettling of all, their optics system. That simple phrase, optics system, would eventually send shockwaves through British intelligence circles. British engineers and tank commanders were used to mechanical ingenuity, of course. They had seen innovations before, but the reports of the Panther's sights, the mechanism that allowed its gunners to detect, range, and hit targets with deadly accuracy, were unlike anything they had encountered. Not just faster or sharper, but far more advanced than anything in the Allied arsenal. The descriptions were almost clinical, but the implications were terrifying. One man could sit in a tank miles away and, with frightening accuracy, strike targets that would have been invisible to anyone else. It was during one of the Allied advances that the first tangible evidence emerged. A Panther had been disabled, abandoned by its crew after sustaining damage to its engine. British forces moved in cautiously. The battlefield was littered with debris, the air thick with smoke, and the acrid smell of spent ammunition. Amid the wreckage, the Panther's hull loomed silent, almost regal in its deadly stillness. Commanders and engineers circled the tank warily, aware that even a damaged Panther represented a massive technological leap over anything the Allies had seen. And then they saw it. The optics. Mounted at the front of the tank, the device seemed almost unassuming at first. A simple lens, some brass fittings, a steel casing. But the engineers' eyes quickly betrayed their awe. They recognized immediately that what lay before them was far beyond standard tank vision. The precision, the clarity, the range, it was something that required decades of research to replicate. Yet here it was, forged in the heart of war. They could hardly believe what they were looking at. Inside the command tent, diagrams and sketches were hurriedly drawn. Technical officers scribbled notes, trying to understand the intricate arrangement of lenses, prisms, and sighting mechanisms. Every line, every gear, every small adjustment spoke of an understanding of optics and ballistics that was years ahead of the Allies' capabilities. They could see, even in the dim light of the tent, that this was not merely a tool, it was a weapon in its own right, a machine designed to kill with terrifying efficiency. The engineers started to imagine the Panther on the battlefield, moving silently through mud and forest, its gunners spotting targets at distances previously thought impossible. They realized the reports weren't exaggerations. The stories soldiers had told around campfires, the accuracy, the seemingly impossible shots were all grounded in this one extraordinary piece of engineering. The optics system explained it all. But with wonder came a cold realization. How many of these machines were still out there? How many had already been lost in battle, unseen by Allied forces, leaving behind nothing but fear and death in their wake? The British command began to mobilize, not just to study the tank, but to figure out how to counter it. Because understanding was only the first step. Surviving it, that was another story entirely. It was at that moment, as the engineers worked into the night, that the significance of their discovery began to sink in. They were not just looking at a tank site, they were staring at a glimpse of the future of armored warfare. Every calculation, every optical adjustment, every painstakingly engineered component was a statement. The Germans were thinking several moves ahead, crafting tools that could dominate the battlefield long before the Allies had caught up. The excitement was palpable, yes, but mingled with unease. For years, British engineers had prided themselves on innovation, on creating machines that could match or exceed enemy designs. Yet here, In a cold field somewhere in Europe, they faced proof that the war was changing faster than anyone could predict. And the Panther's optics system was at the heart of that change. As the sun began to rise, filtering weak light through the morning mist, the engineers and commanders paused. The battlefield was quiet again, but the hum of understanding had already begun. This discovery would not just influence tank designs, it would reshape tactics, strategies, and the very way war was waged. They could not yet imagine the full impact, but they knew one thing with certainty. What they had found here, in the form of a seemingly simple lens, would echo through military history in ways that would astonish generations to come. The morning light fell over the abandoned Panther like a spotlight, highlighting every contour of its armored shell, every seam where steel plates met. British engineers moved cautiously, circling the tank with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. They had seen tanks before, many tanks, but nothing prepared them for the complexity and ingenuity hidden within this single vehicle. It was as though someone had taken everything they knew about armored warfare and pushed it further, sharper, faster. The optics system was the first focus. At first glance, it looked deceptively simple: a lens protruding from the turret, a small eyepiece for the gunner, some mechanical dials and knobs. But as the engineers began to examine it, they realized they were dealing with an entirely different level of sophistication. Inside the casing, multiple lenses were arranged in perfect alignment, each calibrated to magnify, focus, and adjust with an accuracy that bordered on obsessive perfection. The prisms redirected light, corrected distortions, and allowed the gunner to calculate range with astonishing speed. Every component told a story of precision. The adjustment dials were smooth, the gears meshing without any hint of slack. Even under the stress of combat conditions, the mechanism would hold its alignment, a feature the Allies could only dream of replicating. What was most remarkable, however, was the sighting system's ability to account for distance, wind, and even subtle movement of the tank itself. It was, in effect, a mechanical brain built to assist a human operator in delivering perfect fire. British engineers could hardly contain their astonishment. One of them muttered that it was like staring at the future. And in many ways, that was exactly what it felt like. They took apart components carefully, sketching, measuring, and testing, trying to understand how the Germans had managed to build something so advanced while the Allies were still perfecting simpler, less accurate designs. The Panther's gunners had an edge unlike any others on the battlefield. Where an Allied tank commander might take precious seconds lining up a shot, the Panther could track, calculate, and fire almost instinctively. In the chaos of war, those seconds meant life or death, and the optics system gave its crew an edge that seemed almost unfair. Reports from the front lines now made chilling sense. Accounts of Panthers striking tanks from impossible distances, of shells hitting moving targets with near-surgical precision. It was all explained by this one piece of engineering. But it wasn't just the accuracy that impressed the British observers. The optics system also allowed for rapid target acquisition. By using a combination of magnification levels and carefully designed reticles, the gunner could scan the battlefield, find a target, and engage in moments. The system even had a rudimentary form of range finding built into the sight, letting crews make adjustments for distance without needing separate instruments. Every detail was meticulously designed, a testament to German engineering and battlefield experience. As the day wore on, engineers began comparing the Panther's system to Allied optics. The differences were staggering. Where British sights were functional, the Panthers were almost elegant in their operation. Even under battlefield stress, vibrations, and rough terrain, the system would remain stable. The lenses were coated in a way that reduced glare, prisms allowed for precise light correction, and the mechanical design meant there was almost no delay in movement or response. In short, this was not just a tool for seeing, it was a weapon that amplified human ability to lethal levels. Officers began to speculate about how many of these tanks were still operational across Europe. How many had already shifted the balance of entire skirmishes without anyone realizing it? Every encounter the Allies had lost to Panthers suddenly made more sense. The stories of tanks being taken out from distances that seemed impossible were no longer hyperbole, they were facts, explained by optical engineering that far exceeded anything previously encountered. Beyond the mechanics, there was a psychological impact. British crews now understood that facing a Panther meant more than armor or firepower. The gunners could see you before you saw them. They could calculate your movement before you calculated theirs. Even the most confident tank commander had to accept that one glance through that lens could spell destruction. Engineers began to feel a mix of awe and unease. This wasn't just innovation. It was a weapon designed to dominate every engagement, to instill fear even before combat began. The British command quickly realized that understanding the Panther's optics could no longer remain theoretical. If the Allies were to develop strategies, improve tank designs, or even survive engagements with these machines, they had to study every detail. Every lens, every gear, every mechanical nuance had to be documented. And so, with painstaking care, engineers began reverse engineering what they could, hoping to glean secrets that could one day be turned against their creators. They also examined how the system was integrated into the tank itself. Unlike Allied designs, where optics were often afterthoughts bolted onto the turret, the Panther's sight was central to its operation. The entire tank was built around the concept that its gunner could dominate the battlefield visually. Armor, mobility, and firepower were all designed to complement that capability. It was a synergy of engineering that the British had rarely seen, and it left them both impressed and wary. As hours turned into evening, a sense of urgency filled the tent. Engineers and officers worked side by side, sketching diagrams, recording measurements, and debating implications. They understood that what they were witnessing was more than a technical curiosity, it was a turning point. The lessons learned here would influence Allied tank design, battlefield tactics, and even the strategy for how armored units were deployed. The Panther had revealed a hidden layer of warfare, one where sight and precision could outweigh brute force. Yet, amid all this analysis, there was also a human element. Soldiers and commanders alike realized that the Panther's brilliance had already cost countless lives. Each mechanism, each lens, each gear was a silent witness to battles fought, men lost, and the brutal calculus of war. It was both a marvel and a warning, a reminder that technology in the wrong hands could be devastating, and that understanding it quickly could mean the difference between victory and disaster. By the time the British forces withdrew from the site, the engineers had gathered what they could, but questions remained. How could they replicate this level of precision? How many Panthers were still out there, unseen and deadly? And most pressing of all, could the Allies adapt quickly enough to counter a weapon designed not just to kill, but to dominate the very way armored warfare was conducted? The discovery of the Panther's optics system had transformed the British understanding of the battlefield. No longer was tank warfare simply a contest of armor and guns. Now it was also a contest of vision, precision, and speed. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the wreckage, the command tent buzzed with activity. Plans were being made, theories were debated, and a quiet sense of determination settled over the men. They had seen the future, and now they had to meet it head-on. The days following the discovery were tense. British command knew that the Panther was no longer just another German tank. They were dealing with a machine that had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. Every report from the front was scrutinized, every engagement re-examined in the light of what they had learned. Commanders realized that strategies once considered sound were now vulnerable. One misstep against a Panther could mean catastrophic losses. Back at the engineering tent, the atmosphere was electric. The sketches, the measurements, the painstaking notes taken from the Panther's optics system were compiled, analyzed, and debated. The engineers were desperate to understand how the Germans had managed to pack so much precision into a single, field-ready instrument. Some argued it was pure ingenuity. Others whispered that it was the result of a lifetime of focused research by experts who had anticipated every variable of combat. Either way, the conclusion was inescapable. The Panther had turned human skill into a devastating extension of technology. As the British teams worked tirelessly, word of the discovery reached the highest levels of command. Tanks were dispatched to test theories, and gunners were trained to understand not just the mechanics of the machine, but the mindset of the crew who could use such a tool with lethal effectiveness. War, they realized, had entered a new phase. It was no longer only about who had more shells or thicker armor. It was about who could see first, who could calculate faster, and who could strike with near-unerring precision. Stories began circulating from those who had faced Panthers in battle. Survivors spoke of shots that seemed impossible, of shells that struck before the enemy had a chance to react. They recounted the eerie calm of the German crews, their confidence born not of bravado, but of knowing their optics could pierce the fog, the distance, and the chaos. For those on the receiving end, it was terrifying. For the British engineers examining the abandoned tank, it was awe-inspiring. The engineers soon discovered subtle but ingenious features of the optics system. Tiny adjustments allowed for rapid changes in range and elevation. Specialized reticles made estimating target movement instinctive. Even the housing of the sight was designed to minimize distortion, ensuring the gunner always had a true picture of the battlefield. Every detail had been optimized for war, refined over years of trial and error, tested in the harshest of conditions. And yet, amid all the technical brilliance, a deeper lesson emerged. War was no longer just a contest of men or machines, it was a contest of knowledge. The Germans had leveraged science and engineering to create a force multiplier, something that amplified human capability in ways that were almost frightening. The British now faced a challenge that went beyond tactics or numbers. They had to evolve, adapt, and innovate faster than the enemy, or face the consequences. British command immediately began to implement changes. Tank crews were trained in countermeasures, reconnaissance tactics were revised, and intelligence officers pored over every scrap of information regarding Panther deployments. There was no time for hesitation. The Panther was already reshaping the front lines. Every engagement became a test, not just of firepower, but of understanding. Those who underestimated the tank's optical advantage did so at their peril. The psychological effect was undeniable. Soldiers knew that somewhere on the battlefield, a Panther could see them long before they saw it. It forced a new kind of caution, a new kind of respect for engineering and foresight. The battlefield was no longer only about courage, it was about calculation, awareness, and anticipating an enemy who had already mastered the unseen variables of combat. Despite the initial shock, the British engineers remained determined. They meticulously documented everything, experimenting with new sight designs, testing prototype optics, and integrating lessons learned from the Panther into Allied tank development. The war demanded rapid adaptation, and while the Germans had gained a temporary advantage, the British resolve was unyielding. Every drawing, every adjustment, every late-night calculation was a step toward evening the odds. Over time, the significance of the discovery became clear. The Panther's optics system was not just a technological marvel, it was a symbol of how warfare was evolving. Future battles would be decided not only by armor or artillery, but by clarity of vision, speed of calculation, and the ability to merge human skill with mechanical precision. It had forever changed how commanders approached strategy, how engineers approached design, and how soldiers approached the battlefield. And yet, for all its brilliance, there was a quiet melancholy. Each component, each lens, each precise gear was a reminder of lives lost, of men cut down in the shadow of a machine that seemed almost unstoppable. The engineers understood that this was the double-edged nature of innovation, a testament to human ingenuity, but also a harbinger of destruction when wielded in war. As the sun set over the European fields where the Panther had been discovered, British officers and engineers paused to reflect. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a machine that blurred the line between human and mechanical capability, a tool that could dictate the outcome of battles before they even began. But more importantly, they had understood its lessons. The future of war would belong to those who could see further, act faster, and adapt more swiftly than their opponents. In that quiet moment, there was both awe and resolve. The Panther's optics system had shown them a glimpse of the future, one that demanded respect, innovation, and unyielding determination. And while the war raged on, the knowledge gained from that single, abandoned tank would echo through strategy rooms, design workshops, and battlefields for the remainder of the conflict and far beyond. The legacy of that discovery was clear. In war, vision is power, precision is survival, and innovation can turn even the smallest lens into a weapon that changes everything.